Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to explore one of the most shocking and dramatic turns in Eastern Europe's recent history, the possible end of Alexander Lukashenko's long and iron-fisted rule in Belarus, and how parts of his own army have turned against him. For nearly 3 decades, Lukashenko has ruled Belarus with an unyielding grip, silencing dissent, controlling the media, and aligning closely with Russia. But now, that once iron wall of control appears to be cracking from within. The Belarusian military, once seen as his most loyal institution, is reportedly fracturing, and the rebellion within its ranks may be signaling the final chapter of Lukashenko's rule. To understand how this moment arrived, we need to look at the history of his power. Lukashenko took control in 1994, presenting himself as a man of the people after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He promised stability, jobs, and order, things that many Belarusians desperately wanted at the time. But what followed was a dictatorship built on fear, propaganda, and loyalty to Moscow. Over the years, he maintained his position by suppressing political opponents, imprisoning journalists, and using the security forces to crush protests. He survived economic crises, mass uprisings, and even international sanctions. But no dictator, no matter how strong, can rule forever when the foundations beneath him begin to erode. That erosion began to accelerate after the 2020 election, an election widely seen as fraudulent. When massive protests erupted across the country, demanding democracy and fair elections, Lukashenko's response was brutal. Tens of thousands were arrested, opposition leaders were exiled, and peaceful demonstrations were met with tear gas and rubber bullets. It seemed that the dictator had survived once again, backed by the unwavering support of his military and Russia's promise of protection. But that illusion of control masked growing discontent among the people and even within the armed forces themselves. The Belarusian army had long been a pillar of Lukashenko's power. But beneath the surface, divisions were deepening. Many young officers, educated in a new generation of military academies and exposed to Western ideas, began questioning their role. They saw how their country was being dragged into Russia's war in Ukraine, how Belarus was becoming internationally isolated, and how corruption was bleeding the nation dry. While Lukashenko claimed to protect national sovereignty, it became increasingly clear that Belarus was losing its independence, serving instead as a satellite of Moscow. That realization planted seeds of rebellion among those who had once vowed to defend him. The breaking point came when Lukashenko allegedly ordered units of the Belarusian army to fully integrate with Russian command structures and prepare for potential combat deployment alongside Russian forces. For many officers, this was too far. Belarusian soldiers did not want to die in a foreign war that served Putin's interests, not their own country's. Quietly, resistance began to grow within the ranks. Some soldiers refused to follow orders. Others leaked information to the opposition abroad. And then, in a moment that shocked the nation, reports surfaced of entire battalions laying down their arms and refusing to obey the central command. The spark that ignited the full-scale rebellion reportedly began in the western region of the country, where army officers publicly declared that they would no longer recognize Lukashenko's authority. Videos began circulating online, showing soldiers removing their national insignias, declaring that the Belarusian people, not the dictator, were their true commanders. Within days, small-scale mutinies began spreading to other regions. Government forces tried to suppress the movement. But the rebellion had already gained momentum. At first, Lukashenko dismissed the reports as foreign propaganda, blaming Western intelligence agencies for stirring chaos. But as the situation worsened, it became impossible to deny. Military bases were seized by rebel forces, communication lines were cut, and several high-ranking officials reportedly defected. The once feared KGB security service struggled to maintain control as civilians joined in solidarity with the mutinous soldiers. Crowds gathered in cities, waving the historic white-red-white Belarusian flag that had become the symbol of resistance since 2020. This was not just a military revolt, it was a national awakening. For the first time in years, the fear that Lukashenko had used to rule was fading. The rebellion unified people from all walks of life, students, workers, veterans, and even members of the clergy, all demanding one thing: the end of dictatorship. Meanwhile, reports surfaced that Lukashenko had retreated to a heavily guarded compound near Minsk, surrounded by his most loyal guards, issuing desperate orders to crush the uprising. But with loyalty crumbling within his own ranks, his commands were ignored or delayed. Russia, Lukashenko's longtime ally, found itself in a dilemma. Supporting him militarily risked sparking another front of instability near its borders, especially at a time when Moscow's resources were already stretched thin by the war in Ukraine. However, abandoning him would send a dangerous signal to other pro-Russian leaders that Kremlin protection was not guaranteed. For a while, Moscow hesitated. Kremlin spokespersons issued vague statements calling for stability in Belarus, but the silence from Putin himself spoke volumes. Internationally, reactions were swift and divided. Western nations expressed cautious optimism, hoping that the rebellion might lead to genuine democratic reform in Belarus. Opposition leaders in exile called on the rebels to remain united and to avoid bloodshed, urging the international community to support the movement for freedom. Neighboring countries tightened their borders, fearing instability might spill over, while humanitarian groups prepared for a possible refugee crisis if the situation turned violent. Inside Belarus, the chaos deepened. State television went off air for several hours after workers reportedly walked out in protest. Police units, overwhelmed and demoralized, began abandoning their posts. In some towns, local councils declared independence from the central government, pledging to support the army rebels. The country was effectively split, parts still under the dictator's control and others liberated by the uprising. Rumors spread that Lukashenko's family had fled abroad, while others claimed he was negotiating safe passage out of the country. The streets of Minsk, once symbols of repression, became battlegrounds of hope. Barricades appeared, but unlike in previous uprisings, this time the people were not alone. They had the army, or at least a large part of it, on their side. The sound of gunfire mixed with chants of "Long live Belarus" echoed through the capital. For a moment, it felt as if history itself had turned against the dictator. By the time international news outlets confirmed the scale of the rebellion, it was clear that Lukashenko's grip on power had all but collapsed. Government buildings were being occupied by military councils, and rebel leaders were calling for the formation of a transitional authority. They pledged to hold free elections, release political prisoners, and restore constitutional democracy. Whether this would be achieved peacefully remained uncertain, but the symbolism was powerful. After nearly 30 years, the era of Lukashenko appeared to be ending. As the dust settled, one truth became undeniable: fear had finally broken. The same system that relied on loyalty and control had been undone from within. The soldiers who once enforced his will had chosen to defend their nation instead of their ruler. For many Belarusians, this was not just the fall of a dictator. It was the rebirth of a country that had been silenced for too long. The story of Belarus serves as a reminder that no amount of power or propaganda can suppress the human desire for freedom forever. Dictators may appear invincible, but their rule always depends on those willing to carry out their orders. Once that obedience cracks, the entire structure collapses. Lukashenko's downfall, if confirmed, would stand as one of the most dramatic examples of a regime consumed by its own machinery of control. The world now watches what comes next. Will Belarus emerge as a free, democratic state? Will chaos and instability follow the dictator's fall? Or will foreign powers attempt to shape the outcome for their own interests? Whatever happens, one thing is certain: the old order is gone. The Belarusian people and their army have spoken. The dictator who once seemed untouchable now stands on the wrong side of history. And for the first time in decades, there is a glimpse of hope on the horizon for a nation long denied its voice.